the autumn of 1883, in a small farming community nestled in the rolling hills of western New Jersey, something happened that would challenge everything the residents believed about the nature of reality itself. The town was called Morristown, the well-known Revolutionary War site, but a smaller, forgotten settlement that shared the name. A place where the railroad hadn't yet reached, where news from the outside world arrived weeks late, and where the boundary between the natural and supernatural seemed thinner somehow. What I'm about to share with you comes from a collection of documents discovered in 2019 during the renovation of an old Presbyterian church in rural New Jersey, hidden beneath loose floorboards in what was once the pastor's study. These papers had remained untouched for over a century. The documents include journal entries, newspaper clippings, witness testimonies, and correspondence between religious authorities, all centered around one man and the inexplicable events that transformed him into something else entirely. The case of the Morristown Lantern Man. To understand what happened in that isolated community, we must first understand the world of 1883 America. The Industrial Revolution was reshaping the nation, but rural areas like Morristown remained largely untouched by progress. Life moved to the rhythm of seasons in Scripture. The community of roughly 300 souls was bound together by shared faith, mutual dependence, and an unspoken agreement that some things were best left unexamined. Where are you watching from? Comment your city and country below so we can see how far these stories are traveling. And don't forget to subscribe. New spine-chilling tales are coming soon, and you won't want to miss a single one. The town consisted of scattered farmsteads connected by dirt roads that became impassable in heavy rain. At its center stood the Presbyterian church, a modest wooden structure with a bell tower that could be heard from miles across the valley. Next to it, the general store served as both commercial hub and informal gathering place, where news, gossip, and fears were exchanged with equal currency. The people of Morristown were God-fearing folk, but their faith was tinged with older beliefs remnants of Dutch and Germanic traditions brought by earlier settlers. They spoke of protective charms, of certain crossroads to avoid after dark, of signs and portents that preceded calamity. The pastor, Reverend Samuel Whitmore, tolerated these superstitions as harmless folklore, focusing his sermons on Christian salvation and moral behavior. It was into this insular world that our story's central figure emerged from obscurity to become something far more disturbing than legend. His name was Ezekiel Marsh. According to church records, discovered among the hidden documents, Marsh was born in Morristown in 1851, making him 32 years old when the events began. He was described by contemporaries as an unremarkable man, medium height, brown hair, quiet disposition. He lived alone in a modest cabin on the outskirts of town, earning his living as a woodcutter and occasional farmhand. By all accounts, Ezekiel was deeply religious, attending Sunday services without fail and participating in community prayer meetings. Pastor Whitmore's journal describes him as a man of simple faith and honest labor, though perhaps too given to solitary contemplation. Neighbors recall him as helpful but withdrawn, someone who preferred the company of trees to people. This preference for solitude would prove significant as events unfolded. Ezekiel's routine was as predictable as the seasons. He would rise before dawn, offer prayers, and head into the surrounding forest to cut timber. He moved through the woods with an almost supernatural knowledge of every trail, every clearing, every hidden grove. Local children whispered that he could find his way through the forest blindfolded, that he could sense the presence of animals before they appeared, that he seemed more at home among the trees than in the company of his fellow Christians. But it was his evening ritual that would ultimately lead to his transformation. Each night, as darkness settled over the valley, Ezekiel would take his lantern and walk the perimeter of the town. This wasn't an official duty. No one had asked him to patrol the area. He simply felt called to do so. He told the pastor, called to ensure that his neighbors slept safely, that no harm approached their homes under cover of darkness. For years, this nocturnal vigil was viewed as harmless eccentricity. Residents would sometimes glimpse the distant glow of his lantern bobbing through the trees, and it became a source of comfort. Ezekiel's making his rounds, they would say, pulling their blankets closer. The light meant safety, meant someone was watching over them while they slept. No one questioned why he felt compelled to walk the same circuit every night. No one asked what he was protecting them from. The first signs that something was changing occurred in late September 1883, during what should have been a routine evening patrol. Mrs. Elizabeth Carmichael, whose farmhouse sat closest to the forest edge, was the first to notice something unusual. In a letter to her sister in Philadelphia, dated October 2nd, 1883, one of the documents found beneath the church floorboards, she wrote, "Sister, the strangest thing has occurred. You know of Ezekiel Marsh, the woodsman who walks with his lantern. Each evening, for 3 nights now, I have observed his light from my kitchen window, but something is different. The light seems brighter somehow, more intense than any lantern should be, and the pattern of his walking has changed. Instead of following the established paths, he seems to be walking in circles great, wide circles that encompass the entire town. When I mentioned this to my husband, he insisted I was imagining things, but I know what I have seen." This letter was among several pieces of correspondence that suggests the residents of Morristown began experiencing a collective unease around this time. Though none could articulate exactly why, Reverend Whitmore's journal entry from October 5th, 1883, provides additional insight. Spoke with Brother Marsh after evening service. He appeared, altered somehow. Still the same quiet, devout man, but there was something in his eyes of depth I had not noticed before. When I inquired about his nightly walks, he spoke of maintaining the boundary and keeping watch for those who would disturb the peace. I pressed him for clarification, but he grew agitated and excused himself abruptly. I fear his isolation may be affecting his mental state, but it wasn't mental deterioration that was affecting Ezekiel Marsh. Something far more fundamental was occurring, something that would challenge every assumption the people of Morristown held about the nature of reality. The second documented incident occurred on October 12, 1883, and involved multiple witnesses. A harvest celebration had been held at the church, lasting well into the evening. As families prepared to return to their homes, young Timothy Fletcher, the blacksmith's son, came running back into the church hall, breathless with excitement and fear. According to witness testimonies collected by Pastor Whitmore, Timothy claimed he had seen the Lantern Man standing motionless at the edge of the forest, but something was wrong with the scene. The lantern appeared to be floating several feet above where Ezekiel should have been standing. When the adults investigated, they found no one there, only a faint, lingering glow that seemed to hover in the air before fading entirely. The boy was dismissed as having an overactive imagination, but Thomas Fletcher, the blacksmith, later confided to the pastor that he too had seen something unusual. In Whitmore's journal, Fletcher spoke to me privately of that evening. He claims that as they approached the area where young Timothy saw the floating light, he noticed the trees themselves seemed different. Wrong was the word he used. The branches appeared to be arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly, geometric configurations that shouldn't have been possible in nature. When we returned the following morning to investigate, everything appeared normal. These incidents might have been dismissed as isolated delusions, but they were only the beginning. Over the following weeks, reports began accumulating of increasingly strange encounters with the Lantern Man. Mrs. Sarah Holbrook reported seeing Ezekiel walking his circuit, but claimed his shadow was moving independently of his body, stretching and contracting in ways that defied the position of the moon. When she called out to him, he turned toward her, and she swore his eyes reflected the lantern light like those of a nocturnal animal. Farmer Jacob Winters encountered Ezekiel near the old cemetery and noted that the man's footsteps made no sound on the fallen leaves. Even more disturbing, Winters claimed that as Ezekiel passed between 2 large oak trees, his body appeared to bend and flow around them in a manner that suggested his physical form had become somehow ... malleable. Asterisk, but perhaps the most unsettling. The account came from young Mary Patterson, the pastor's niece, who was visiting from Albany. On the night of October 24th, she claimed to have observed Ezekiel from her bedroom window, according to her testimony, preserved in a letter to her parents, Uncle Samuel. I know you will think me foolish, but I must tell you what I witnessed. The Lantern Man was walking his usual path, but as I watched, he seemed to multiply. First, there were two figures, carrying identical lights, then three, then more than I could count. They moved in perfect unison, each maintaining the exact same distance from the others, creating a pattern of lights that surrounded the entire town. When I blinked and looked again, there was only one figure, standing directly beneath my window, looking up at me with eyes that glowed with the same light as his lantern. Pastor Whitmore initially dismissed his niece's account as the product of an overwrought imagination, but he couldn't ignore the growing pattern of reports. Something was happening to Ezekiel Marsh, something that transcended normal human experience. The pastor's crisis of faith began in earnest when he decided to confront the situation directly. On the night of October 30th, 1883, Reverend Whitmore positioned himself along Ezekiel's usual route, determined to observe the man's nocturnal activities firsthand. His journal entry from November 1st describes what he witnessed. I stationed myself behind the large elm near the Hendricks farm, arriving well before sunset to ensure I would not be seen. As darkness fell, I waited with growing apprehension. When Ezekiel appeared, carrying his familiar lantern, I was initially relieved to see that he appeared entirely normal, but as I continued to observe, I began to notice ... irregularities. His pace never varied, maintaining a rhythm that seemed almost mechanical in its precision. He did not pause to rest, did not adjust his grip on the lantern, did not even appear to breathe in the manner of exertion one would expect from such a lengthy walk. But these observations paled beside what occurred as he passed my hiding place. The light from his lantern began to change. What had started as the warm, yellow glow of burning oil gradually shifted to something colder, more intense. The illumination took on a quality I struggled to describe. It seemed to reveal more than it should have, casting shadows that formed patterns too complex and precise to be natural. The very air around Ezekiel appeared to shimmer and distort, as if reality itself was bending in his presence. But it was when he stopped and turned toward my hiding place that I truly understood the magnitude of what was occurring. His eyes, they held the same otherworldly light as his lantern, not merely reflecting it, but generating it from within. And in that light, I saw an intelligence that was simultaneously human and utterly alien. He looked directly at me, despite my careful concealment, and smiled. It was Ezekiel's face, but the expression was wrong to knowing, too vast, as if something immense was looking out through his features. He raised one hand in greeting, and I swear to you, that hand cast 5 distinct shadows in 5 different directions, despite there being only one source of light. I fled then, abandoning all pretense of investigation. I ran through the forest like a child, crashing through underbrush, driven by a terror I cannot adequately express. When I finally reached the safety of my home, I found that my watch had stopped at the exact moment Ezekiel had smiled at me. It has not worked since. What have we allowed to walk among us? What have I, in my ignorance and pride, failed to recognize? I fear that Ezekiel Marsh is no longer the simple woodsman we once knew. I fear that something else now inhabits his form, something that has been using his nightly walks for purposes we cannot fathom. Following this encounter, Pastor Whitmore began a careful investigation into the history of the area, searching through church records, land deeds, and local folklore for any information that might explain what was happening to Ezekiel. What he discovered would shake his faith to its foundations. The land where Morristown was built had a hidden history. Before European settlement, it had been considered sacred and dangerous by the local Lenape tribes. According to oral traditions, recorded by early missionaries, the area was known as the crossing place, where the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds grew thin. The indigenous peoples had performed specific rituals to maintain these boundaries, to ensure that what belonged in one realm did not spill over into the other. When the European settlers arrived and established their community, they unknowingly disrupted these ancient protections. The Presbyterian Church had been built directly over what the Lenape called a threshold, a point where the barrier between worlds was naturally weak. For decades, the community had prospered despite this cosmic vulnerability, but something had changed in 1883. Some shift in the spiritual landscape that had begun affecting those most sensitive to such influences. Ezekiel, with his deep connection to the forest and his nightly vigils, had become a focal point for forces beyond human comprehension. But Pastor Whitmore's research revealed an even more disturbing possibility. In a collection of letters from the town's founding pastor, dated 1847, he found references to another incident involving unnatural illumination and a man transformed by otherworldly influences. The earlier case had been quietly suppressed. The affected individual had simply disappeared one night, and the matter was never spoken of again. The pattern suggested that whatever was happening to Ezekiel had happened before and would likely happen again. The town of Morristown existed in a state of perpetual vulnerability, a condition that its residents had unknowingly accepted as the price of their isolated prosperity. As October turned to November, the manifestations around Ezekiel grew more pronounced and impossible to ignore. Multiple witnesses reported seeing him in several locations simultaneously. The Baker family claimed they saw him walking past their farm, while Mrs. Carmichael insisted he was simultaneously visible from her kitchen window a mile away. These weren't simple cases of mistaken identity. Both sightings featured the distinctive lantern light and Ezekiel's unmistakable gait. More disturbing were reports of the physical changes occurring to the landscape around his nightly routes. Trees that had stood for decades were found twisted into spiraling configurations that followed no natural growth pattern. Stones arranged themselves into geometric patterns overnight, forming shapes that seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythm. The very ground where he walked began to exhibit properties that defied explanation: soil that remained frozen despite warm temperatures, grass that grew in perfect circles, paths that seemed to bend space so that distances became inconsistent. Dr. Marcus Webb, the town's physician, documented several cases of residents experiencing what he termed proximity sickness after encountering Ezekiel during his nocturnal walks. Symptoms included disorientation, temporary blindness, and most unsettling of all, brief periods where affected individuals claimed to perceive additional dimensions of reality spaces and geometries that existed beyond normal human perception. The breaking point came on November 15, 1883. That night, young Samuel Hendricks, son of one of the town's prominent farming families, followed Ezekiel into the forest. The boy had been dared by his friends to discover what the Lantern Man actually did during his long walks through the woods. Samuel never returned. A search party was organized at dawn, led by Pastor Whitmore and several of the townsmen, followed Ezekiel's usual route, looking for any sign of the missing boy. What they found defied rational explanation. In a clearing roughly 2 miles from town, they discovered a perfect circle where the ground had been transformed into something resembling black glass. The surface reflected not the sky above, but what appeared to be star patterns that didn't match any known constellation. Around the perimeter of this circular mirror, the trees had grown into impossible shapes, their trunks braided together in patterns that created doorway-like openings, each one revealing not the forest beyond, but empty. Endless darkness dotted the center of the circle stood Ezekiel. He was motionless, his lantern held high, casting its otherworldly light across the transformed landscape, but something fundamental had changed about his appearance. He seemed taller, though it was difficult to judge proportions in that distorted space. His clothing appeared to be made of the same material as the darkness visible through the treeways, substance that absorbed light while somehow remaining visible. His face, when he turned toward the approaching search party, retained Ezekiel's features, but arranged in configurations that the human eye struggled to process. In his eyes. His eyes held depths that seemed to extend far beyond the physical boundaries of his skull. Pastor Whitmore, in what would be his final journal entry about the case, described the encounter. We called to him, demanded to know what had become of young Samuel, Ezekiel Lord. The thing wearing his form smiled that same terrible smile I had witnessed before. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that seemed to originate from the air itself rather than his throat. The boy has crossed over, he said, and his words created visible ripples in the air around us. He wanted to see, so I showed him. Now he walks in the spaces between spaces, learning the true shape of existence. I demanded he return the child, invoking the name of Christ and all the holy powers I could summon. The thing that had been Ezekiel laughed and the sound was like crystalline wind chimes played by a hurricane. "Your Christ walks in only 3 dimensions," it replied. "I serve those who move through 17. Your God is a provincial deity, Pastor. You worship a local phenomenon, while I commune with universal constants." That was when Thomas Fletcher raised his hunting rifle and fired directly at the creature. The shot should have killed any mortal man, but the bullet simply ... stopped. It hung in the air inches from Ezekiel's chest, spinning slowly as if trapped in invisible amber. "Violence serves no purpose here," the thing said, almost sadly. "This transformation cannot be undone through force. It can only be completed or contained." It gestured toward the treaterways, and we could see movement in the darkness beyond. Shapes that might have been human or might have been something else entirely beckoned from within those impossible spaces. "Join me," Ezekiel continued, "and transcend the limitations of linear existence. Or flee, and spend your remaining years wondering what lies beyond the boundaries of your small reality." None of us were brave enough to accept that invitation. We ran. When we returned with reinforcements the following day, the clearing had returned to normal forest. The black glass circle was gone. The trees stood in their natural configurations, and there was no sign that anything unusual had ever occurred there. But Ezekiel was gone too, and so was young Samuel Hendricks. The official records state that both Ezekiel Marsh and Samuel Hendricks disappeared on November 15, 1883, presumably lost in the forest during adverse weather conditions. Pastor Whitmore filed no report of the supernatural encounter, understanding that such claims would only bring unwanted attention to his community. But the story doesn't end with their disappearance. In the weeks following the incident, several residents reported continued sightings of the lantern light in the forest. These weren't the familiar, comforting glimpses they had grown accustomed to over the years. The light now moved in patterns that suggested intelligence, but not humanity. It would appear at the edge of the tree line, seeming to beckon, then vanish when approached. Mrs. Carmichael's final letter to her sister, dated December 3, 1883, describes her last sighting. "The light returned last night, but it was wrong. In every way. Instead of the warm glow we once knew, it pulsed with colors that have no names. And within its illumination, I swear I could see shapes, figures, walking in single file, always moving deeper into the forest. One of them looked like young Samuel, but his proportions were all wrong, as if he had been stretched and folded to fit dimensions I cannot comprehend. Another figure might have been Ezekiel, but changed so drastically that I cannot be certain. The most horrifying aspect was not what I saw, but what I felt. The light called to me, 'Sister.' It promised knowledge, understanding, freedom from the narrow confines of this mundane existence. For a moment, God forgive me, wanted to follow it. I wanted to step into that impossible radiance and discover what lay beyond the boundaries of ordinary life. I fear that desire has not left me. Each night I find myself drawn to the window, watching for the return of that terrible, beautiful light. How long can I resist its call? How long before I, too, walk into the forest and never return?" This was Mrs. Carmichael's last correspondence. She was found dead in her bed 3 days later, apparently from natural causes, though Dr. Webb noted that her eyes had been open at the time of death and seemed to be staring at something beyond the ceiling of her room. Over the following months, more residents began experiencing what Pastor Whitmore privately termed the calling. They reported dreams of walking through impossible geometries, of seeing reality from perspectives that human minds weren't designed to comprehend, of understanding truths too vast and terrible for ordinary consciousness to contain. One by one, people began to disappear. By the spring of 1884, Morristown's population had dwindled to fewer than 100 souls. Families packed their belongings and left without explanation, heading for larger towns where the influence of whatever dwelt in the forest couldn't reach them. Others simply vanished during the night, leaving behind no trace except for the lingering sense that they had chosen to leave rather than been taken. Pastor Whitmore was among the last to abandon the community. His final journal entry, dated May 17, 1884, reads, "I can no longer maintain the pretense that this is merely a crisis of faith. What we witnessed in that forest clearing was not hallucination or mass hysteria. Something vast and alien has taken root in this place. Something that uses human form as a doorway to realities beyond our understanding. The thing that was Ezekiel Marsh has become a focal point for forces that exist outside the natural order. It offers transcendence at the cost of humanity, knowledge at the price of sanity. Those who have answered its call have not died. They have been translated into something else entirely. Something that can exist in spaces where physical laws become suggestions rather than absolute constraints. I leave this record hidden in the church, in the hope that someday someone will find it and understand what occurred here. To whoever discovers these documents, do not seek out this place. Do not attempt to verify these claims through personal investigation. Some knowledge is too dangerous to pursue, some truths too devastating to uncover. The Morristown Lantern Man still walks. Of this I am certain. He walks not just through our forest, but through the spaces between all forests, in dimensions that intersect with our own in ways we cannot predict or control. He is waiting for others who possess the sensitivity to perceive his light, the curiosity to follow where it leads. If you have read these words, you already know too much. If you find yourself drawn to isolated places at night, if you begin to see patterns in nature that seem too perfect to be coincidental, if lights appear in your peripheral vision that vanish when you turn to look directly at them, flee, flee, to places where concrete and steel have buried the old connections, where electric lights banish the subtle glows that beckon from the boundaries of perception. Do not let curiosity overcome caution. Do not assume that knowledge, no matter how profound, is worth the price demanded for its acquisition. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The Presbyterian Church in Morristown was abandoned in May 1884. The building stood empty, for decades, gradually falling into ruin as the forest reclaimed the surrounding land. By 1920, even the foundations had disappeared beneath encroaching vegetation, leaving no trace that a community had ever existed there. But the story of the Morristown Lantern Man didn't end. With the abandonment of the town, throughout the following decades, there have been sporadic reports of unusual lights appearing in the forests of western New Jersey. Hikers, hunters, and campers have described encounters with a figure carrying a lantern that glows with unnatural intensity. These sightings follow a consistent pattern, a tall figure moving through the trees with purpose, leaving behind physical evidence of its passage in the form of geometric patterns carved into bark, stones arranged in impossible configurations, in areas where the normal laws of physics seem temporarily suspended. Most witnesses dismiss these encounters as tricks of light or imagination. But a few those, with the sensitivity that Pastor Whitmore identified, report more disturbing details. They speak of feeling watched by an intelligence vast beyond human comprehension, of receiving invitations to step outside the boundaries of ordinary existence, of glimpsing realities that exist in dimensions our minds cannot fully process. The majority of these individuals eventually seek help from mental health professionals, convinced that they are experiencing psychological breakdown, but a small percentage simply disappear, leaving behind no trace except for the persistent feeling among their loved ones that they chose to leave rather than being taken against their will. In 1987, a team of anthropologists from Princeton University conducted a study of local folklore in central New Jersey. Their research uncovered dozens of accounts describing encounters with mysterious lights in forested areas, always associated with a figure carrying a lantern. The report spanned over a century and showed remarkable consistency in their details. Despite coming from witnesses who had no contact with each other, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who led the Princeton study, noted in her published report, the persistence and uniformity of these accounts suggests either a shared cultural narrative passed down through generations, or the ongoing presence of some phenomenon that transcends normal explanation. While we cannot endorse supernatural interpretations, we must acknowledge that the witnesses we interviewed displayed none of the typical indicators of fabrication or delusion. Dr. Mitchell's study was completed, but never officially published. According to her colleagues, she became increasingly obsessed with the Lantern Man accounts, spending weeks alone in the forests where sightings had been reported. She claimed to be developing a new theoretical framework for understanding the relationship between consciousness and dimensional reality. Based on patterns she had discovered in the witness testimonies, Dr. Sarah Mitchell disappeared during a solo research expedition in October 1987. Her campsite was found undisturbed, her notes scattered around an area where the trees had been arranged in the same spiraling configurations described in Pastor Whitmore's journal over a century earlier. More recently, the proliferation of trail cameras and digital photography has captured images that corroborate elements of the historical accounts. In 2003, a motion-activated camera placed by wildlife researchers recorded footage of a luminous figure moving through a New Jersey forest preserve. The figure appears human in general outline, but moves with a fluidity that suggests its physical form is not bound by normal anatomical constraints. Analysis of the footage revealed several anomalies. The figure casts multiple shadows despite the presence of only one light source. Its movement creates visible distortions in the air around it, and at one point it appears to walk directly through a tree trunk, without pausing or changing course. The researchers who captured this footage submitted it to several universities for analysis, but the institutions declined to study the material, citing insufficient academic merit for formal investigation. The footage was subsequently released to paranormal research groups, where it has been dismissed by skeptics as an elaborate hoax and embraced by believers as definitive proof of supernatural phenomena. Both interpretations miss the deeper truth suggested by the historical record. The documents discovered beneath the Morristown church floorboards tell a story that transcends simple categories of hoax or genuine supernatural occurrence. They describe an ongoing process of transformation that affects both individuals and the fabric of reality itself. The Lantern Man is not a ghost in the traditional sense, nor is he entirely human. He represents something more fundamental, a point where the boundaries of existence become permeable, where consciousness can expand beyond the limitations of three-dimensional space. The pattern evident in over a century of accounts suggests that this phenomenon operates according to its own logic, appearing to those who possess certain sensitivities while remaining invisible to others. It offers a choice: remain within the comfortable boundaries of conventional reality, or step into a larger existence that encompasses dimensions and perspectives beyond human comprehension. Those who accept this invitation undergo a transformation that places them outside the normal categories of life and death, presence and absence. They become something new, something that can exist simultaneously in multiple realities, moving through spaces that intersect with our own in ways we cannot predict or control. But what does this mean for us today? Are we safe in our urban environments, protected by concrete and electric light from the subtle influences that once claimed the residents of remote Morristown? Or do the boundaries between dimensions remain as permeable as ever, requiring only the right circumstances to reveal themselves? The evidence suggests that the phenomenon continues to operate, selecting individuals who display the necessary sensitivity and offering them the same choice that was presented to Ezekiel Marsh over a century ago. The transformation appears to be irreversible once begun, leading either to transcendence into a larger reality or to a form of existence that can no longer be called human in any meaningful sense. Consider the implications of this possibility. If the Morristown Lantern Man represents a genuine supernatural phenomenon, then our understanding of reality is fundamentally incomplete. We exist in a universe where consciousness can transcend physical limitations, where intelligence operates on scales that dwarf human comprehension, where the boundaries between dimensions are far more fragile than we assume. If the accounts are accurate, then somewhere in the forests of New Jersey and, perhaps in isolated places around the world, figures continue to walk ancient patterns, carrying lights that illuminate more than just the physical world. They move through spaces where the normal rules of existence become suggestions rather than laws, offering invitations to those brave or curious enough to abandon the safety of conventional reality. The question that emerges from this investigation is deeply personal. If you encountered such a phenomenon, if you glimpsed the possibility of transcending the limitations of ordinary existence, what choice would you make? Would you flee to the safety of crowds and electric lights, content to remain within the boundaries of three-dimensional space? Or would you accept the invitation to discover what lies beyond the narrow confines of human perception? The historical record suggests that this choice is not merely theoretical. According to the patterns evident in over a century of accounts, the phenomenon continues to select individuals who display certain characteristics: sensitivity to subtle environmental changes, attraction to isolated natural areas, and most importantly, a willingness to question the fundamental nature of reality itself. If you recognize these traits in yourself, if you find yourself drawn to places where the boundaries between the known and unknown seem thin, then you may already be in the early stages of a process that began with Ezekiel Marsh and continues to this day. The transformation described in the historical documents is presented as a choice, but the evidence suggests that once the process begins, the outcome becomes increasingly inevitable. Those who are selected find themselves experiencing changes in perception that make it difficult to remain satisfied with ordinary reality. They begin to see patterns in nature that reveal deeper geometries, to sense presences that exist just beyond normal perception, to understand that the world they once knew represents only a tiny fraction of what actually exists. This progressive awakening culminates in a final decision point: accept complete transformation and step into a larger existence, or resist the process and face an eternity of knowing that transcendence was offered, and refuse. The account suggests that resistance ultimately proves futile. Once an individual has been selected by the phenomenon, once they have glimpsed the vast intelligences that operate beyond human understanding, the limitations of ordinary existence become unbearable. The choice becomes not whether to transform, but whether to do so willingly or be forced into it through mounting psychological pressure. This interpretation explains why so many witnesses eventually disappear rather than simply returning to normal life. The knowledge they acquire during their encounters makes it impossible to resume conventional patterns of existence. They must either transcend humanity entirely or find themselves trapped between worlds, neither fully human nor completely transformed. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this phenomenon is its apparent intelligence. The Morristown Lantern Man is not a mindless force or random occurrence. The historical pattern suggests a deliberate process of selection and cultivation, as if some vast intelligence is gradually harvesting individuals who possess the capacity four-dimensional transcendence. This raises questions about the ultimate purpose of these transformations. Are the missing individuals being absorbed into some collective consciousness that exists beyond physical reality? Are they being prepared for roles in a cosmic hierarchy that spans multiple dimensions? Or are they simply being removed from our reality to prevent them from inadvertently revealing truths that humanity is not yet ready to comprehend? The documents provide no clear answers to these questions, but they do suggest that the phenomenon operates according to a logic that transcends human understanding. The Lantern Man serves as both herald and gateway, identifying suitable candidates and facilitating their transition into something beyond ordinary human existence. From this perspective, the residents of Morristown were not victims of a supernatural predator, but participants in a cosmic process that extends far beyond the boundaries of our three-dimensional reality. Their transformation represents not loss, but evolution, not death, but birth into a larger form of existence. But this interpretation raises its own disturbing questions. If the phenomenon is genuinely beneficial, why does it operate in secrecy? Why does it select isolated individuals rather than revealing itself openly to humanity as a whole? And why do the transformations appear irreversible, cutting all ties between the transcended individuals and their former lives? The answer may be that our current level of consciousness is simply incompatible with the realities the phenomenon represents, just as attempting to explain color to someone born blind would prove futile. The vast intelligences behind these transformations may be incapable of communicating directly with unmodified human consciousness. The selection process, therefore, serves to identify individuals who possess the mental flexibility necessary to comprehend and survive exposure to expanded dimensions of reality. The gradual nature of the transformation allows these candidates to adapt progressively to increasingly alien concepts, until they can finally make the leap into complete transcendence. This brings us to the question that underlies all supernatural investigations. What do we do with knowledge that cannot be verified through conventional means, but appears too consistent and detailed to dismiss as mere folklore? The Morristown Lantern Man case presents us with a century of accounts that display remarkable consistency, despite coming from witnesses separated by decades and geographical distance. The phenomenon described operates according to its own internal logic, producing effects that are strange but not random, supernatural but not chaotic. We can dismiss these accounts as elaborate fiction, but doing so requires us to explain how dozens of independent witnesses arrived at virtually identical details about the appearance and behavior of the phenomenon. We can attribute the reports to mass hysteria or cultural contamination, but this fails to account for the physical evidence that allegedly accompanies the sightings, the geometric patterns carved into trees, the areas where normal physics appears, suspended, the photographic and video documentation that resists conventional explanation. Alternatively, we can accept that the accounts describe genuine encounters with something that exists outside our current scientific understanding. This interpretation requires us to expand our conception of reality to include dimensions and intelligences that operate according to principles we have not yet discovered. Both approaches present challenges. Dismissing the accounts leaves us unable to explain their consistency and persistence across multiple generations. Accepting them forces us to acknowledge that our understanding of reality may be fundamentally incomplete, that consciousness may be capable of transcending physical limitations in ways that current science cannot measure or predict. The middle ground suggests that whether or not the Morristown Lantern Man represents a genuine supernatural phenomenon, the accounts serve as a reflection of deep human anxieties about the nature of existence, consciousness, and our place in a universe that may be far stranger and more complex than we currently understand. But this psychological interpretation becomes problematic when we consider the specific details described in the historical documents. The witnesses report not vague supernatural experiences, but precise alterations in physical reality, lights that cast shadows in impossible directions, figures that appear simultaneously in multiple locations, transformations of landscape that create geometries beyond normal, three-dimensional space. These details suggest encounters with something that operates according to principles fundamentally different from those that govern ordinary reality. Whether we call this phenomenon supernatural, extra-dimensional, or simply unknown, it appears to represent a genuine challenge to our current scientific worldview. The investigation of the Morristown Lantern Man ultimately returns us to questions that have haunted humanity throughout history. Are we alone in the universe? What lies beyond the boundaries of ordinary perception? And what price are we willing to pay to discover answers to these questions? The historical record suggests that some individuals have chosen to pursue these answers, regardless of personal costs. They have accepted invitations to step outside the safety of conventional reality and explore dimensions of existence that transcend human understanding. Their fate remains unknown in any conventional sense. They have not died, according to the accounts, but neither have they remained human. They have become something new, something that exists in spaces where the normal categories of presence and absence, life and death, no longer apply. This transformation represents either the ultimate fulfillment of human potential or the complete abandonment of human identity. The distinction may be meaningless from the perspective of entities that have transcended the limitations of three-dimensional existence, but it remains critically important for those of us who continue to operate within those limitations. The question facing anyone who encounters this material is deeply personal. Do you seek further investigation into these claims, or do you choose the safety of skeptical dismissal? The historical pattern suggests that investigation itself may constitute the first step in a process that becomes increasingly difficult to reverse. Those who actively seek out the phenomenon appear more likely to experience encounters that lead to eventual transformation. The act of searching may itself serve as a signal to the intelligence behind these manifestations, marking the seeker as a potential candidate for selection. But deliberate ignorance carries its own risks. If the phenomenon is genuine, if it represents a genuine opportunity for transcendence, then refusing to investigate may constitute the rejection of humanity's next evolutionary step. We may be choosing the limitations of ordinary existence over the possibility of expanded consciousness and dimensional freedom. The choice cannot be made lightly. The transformation described in the historical accounts appears irreversible once begun. Those who accept the invitation to transcend human limitations must abandon everything that previously defined their existence: relationships, responsibilities, identity itself. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this investigation is the growing awareness that the choice may not be entirely voluntary. The phenomenon appears to select individuals based on criteria we cannot fully understand, gradually exposing them to experiences that make conventional reality increasingly unsatisfactory until transformation becomes psychologically inevitable. From this perspective, learning about the Morristown Lantern Man may itself constitute the beginning of a selection process. The very act of reading these accounts, of considering their implications, may mark you as someone who possesses the mental flexibility necessary for dimensional transcendence. If this interpretation is correct, then everyone who has followed this investigation to its conclusion must now confront a fundamental question. Has your interest in this material been purely intellectual, or do you feel a deeper attraction to the mysteries it describes? Do you find yourself wondering what it would be like to perceive reality from perspectives beyond three-dimensional space? Are you curious about the nature of the intelligences that allegedly operate behind these phenomena? Would you be willing to sacrifice your current existence for the possibility of expanded consciousness? These questions have no comfortable answers. They force us to examine our deepest assumptions about the nature of existence, consciousness, and human potential. They challenge us to consider whether our current reality represents the fullest expression of what we might become, or merely a preliminary stage in a larger process of evolution. The residents of Morristown faced these same questions in 1883. Their responses varied. Some fled to the safety of larger communities. Others disappeared into dimensions beyond normal perception. And a few, like Pastor Whitmore, chose to document their experiences and then retreat to conventional religious faith. But their choice was made in isolation, without access to the broader pattern of reports that has emerged over the past century. We have the advantage of historical perspective, the ability to see these individual incidents as part of a larger phenomenon that continues to operate according to its own mysterious logic. This broader view suggests that the Morristown Lantern Man represents not an isolated supernatural occurrence, but a manifestation of something fundamental about the nature of reality itself. The boundaries between dimensions may be far more permeable than we assume. Consciousness may be capable of transcending physical limitations in ways we do not yet understand, and intelligence may operate on scales that dwarf human comprehension. If these possibilities are genuine, then the phenomenon described in the historical documents is not going away. It will continue to select individuals who display the necessary sensitivity, offer them glimpses of expanded reality, and provide opportunities for transformation that transcend the limitations of ordinary human existence. The question is not whether this will happen, but whether it will happen to you. Have you noticed unusual lights in your peripheral vision that disappear when you turn to look at them directly? Do you feel drawn to isolated natural areas where the boundary between the known and unknown seems thin? Have you begun to see patterns in nature that appear too complex and precise to be coincidental? If so, you may already be in the early stages of a process that began with Ezekiel Marsh over a century ago and continues to select candidates for dimensional transcendence to this day. The choice, as always, remains yours. You can dismiss these accounts as elaborate fiction, return to the safety of conventional skepticism, and continue your existence within the comfortable boundaries of three-dimensional space. Or you can acknowledge the possibility that reality is far stranger and more complex than our current scientific models suggest, that consciousness may be capable of transcending physical limitations, and that somewhere in the forests of New Jersey and, perhaps in isolated places around the world, intelligences continue to operate according to principles that challenge everything we think we know about the nature of existence. But be warned, curiosity about these matters may itself constitute the first step in a transformation process that becomes increasingly difficult to reverse. Those who actively seek out the phenomenon appear more likely to experience encounters that lead to eventual transcendence or disappearance. The Morristown Lantern Man is patient. He has been walking his mysterious patterns for over a century, selecting candidates, offering invitations, facilitating transformations that place individuals beyond the boundaries of ordinary human existence. He may be walking still. And if you have read this far, if you have absorbed these accounts and considered their implications, you may have already attracted his attention. Listen carefully to the sounds around you as you go about your daily life. Pay attention to lights that appear in your peripheral vision. Notice whether patterns in nature seem more complex and significant than they should be. Most importantly, consider whether your interest in these matters feels entirely voluntary, or whether you sense a deeper compulsion drawing you toward mysteries that exist beyond the boundaries of ordinary perception. The historical record suggests that this investigation never truly ends. For those who possess the sensitivity to perceive what lies beyond conventional reality, it continues until a choice is made: remain human and accept the limitations that entails, or step into something larger and abandon everything that previously defined your existence. Have you heard these sounds before? Have you glimpsed lights that have no obvious source? Do you find yourself drawn to places where the boundaries between the known and unknown seem thin? If so, you may already know more about the Morristown Lantern Man than you realize. You may already be chosen. The question that remains is simple but profound. What choice will you make when the invitation comes? Because according to the historical pattern, according to the accounts that span over a century, according to the logic of the phenomenon itself, the invitation always comes. Would you have chosen differently? Have you ever seen unexplained lights in isolated places? Let us know in the comments below, if you're still able to. And if you find yourself drawn to investigate these claims further, remember Pastor Whitmore's warning. Some knowledge is too dangerous to pursue. Some truths too devastating to uncover. The choice, as always, is yours.